What would you do if the quiet woman everyone dismissed as just another immigrant suddenly whispered 3 words that made a hardened mountain man go completely still? On a frozen frontier in Montana, a reclusive mountain man rescued a mysterious young woman from a deadly blizzard, believing he had simply saved a stranger's life. But when she finally recognized a powerful man who had just arrived in town and trembled out the words, "Please," not again, he realized the danger following her was far greater than anyone in Dry Creek could imagine. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. To understand why those words chilled him to the bone and how their lives became tied to a deadly secret buried in the mountains, let's go back to where this story truly begins. The Bitterroot Mountains did not forgive weakness. The wind there moved like a restless spirit slipping through pine forests and across the frozen slopes as if it carried the memories of everyone who had ever tried to tame that land. High above the valley, where the mountains leaned close together and the snow arrived earlier than anywhere else, a small cabin stood alone against the gray sky. That cabin belonged to Elias Boone. People in Dry Creek rarely saw him, and when they did, it was usually only long enough for him to buy a sack of salt, a box of cartridges, or some iron nails before riding back toward the mountains without another word. Most of the town simply called him the Mountain Man. To them, he was a quiet figure who appeared a few times each year and then disappeared again into the wilderness, like someone who belonged more to the mountains than to other people. Elias did not mind the name. His cabin sat halfway up a narrow slope overlooking a long stretch of forest and frozen creek beds. It was built from thick pine logs, cut years earlier and sealed carefully against the winter wind. Smoke rose from its stone chimney almost every evening, and a stack of neatly split firewood stood beside the door, like a small wall of patient preparation against the cold. Inside the cabin was simple but orderly. Every tool had its place. Every rifle knife and coil of rope hung exactly where Elias expected it to be. The table by the window was worn smooth from years of use, and the iron stove in the corner carried the smell of wood smoke that had soaked into the walls long ago. Elias lived by routines the mountains had taught him. In the morning, he checked his trap lines along the tree line. In the afternoon, he mended fences, patched gear, or worked with a small herd of cattle that grazed in the narrow valley below. When the weather allowed, he hunted deer or elk for meat. When it did not, he stayed close to the cabin and waited out the storms. He spoke very little because there was rarely anyone to speak to. Dry Creek lay almost a day's ride away, and Elias only went there when he needed supplies he could not make or hunt himself. Even then, he never lingered. He would ride into town with the same quiet expression, tie his horse outside Samuel Carter's mercantile purchase what he needed, and leave before the evening lamps were lit. The townspeople had long ago stopped asking questions. Men at the saloon sometimes claimed Elias had once been a soldier or a scout for the army. Others believed he had simply been born in the mountains and had never learned how to live anywhere else. No one really knew the truth. Elias preferred it that way. Behind his cabin, a narrow path climbed to a small ridge that overlooked the valley. 3 weathered wooden crosses stood there, leaning slightly with age. Elias passed them every morning. He did not stop. He did not kneel. He did not speak their names. But he always noticed them. The wood had faded to the color of pale ash, and snow often gathered at their bases long after the rest of the hillside had thawed. They marked the place where the last pieces of Elias Boone's family had been laid to rest many years ago. The story of how they died had never reached Dry Creek. Elias had buried that story with them. Over time, the silence of the mountains had become the only life he trusted. The wind, the snow, the creak of pine branches, and the distant cry of wolves were simpler companions than people. For a long time, that silence had been enough. Until the autumn day when a stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek, carrying a woman no one had seen before. The stage from the east arrived late that afternoon, its wheels coated in road dust and the horses steaming faintly in the cold air. Travelers stepped down one by one, stretching stiff limbs and collecting their baggage before disappearing toward the few boarding houses scattered along the street. Among them was a young woman carrying a worn leather suitcase. She stepped down carefully from the coach, adjusting the simple gray cloak around her shoulders. Her clothes were plain enough for someone traveling alone across the frontier, but something about her posture caught the attention of several people nearby. She stood straighter than most travelers. Her movements were quiet, controlled, almost deliberate. Samuel Carter noticed her first. From behind the counter of his mercantile, he watched as she approached the wooden steps leading to his store. "Afternoon," he said when she stepped inside. "Good afternoon," she replied politely. Her voice was soft but clear. "Name's Samuel Carter," he said. "What can I help you with?" "My name is Isabella Whitmore," she answered. "I was told this town might have work." Samuel studied her for a moment. Dry Creek did not receive many women traveling alone, and even fewer who spoke with that kind of careful calm. "You looking for steady work?" he asked. "Yes," Isabella said. "Anything honest?" Samuel glanced around the shop, thinking. His last assistant had left for Helena 2 weeks earlier, and keeping track of shipments, accounts, and sewing repairs alone had become exhausting. "You know how to mend clothes?" he asked. "Yes." "Can you keep simple ledgers?" "I can." Samuel shrugged. "Well, Miss Whitmore, if you're willing to work hard, I can offer a small wage and a room behind the store." Relief flickered briefly in her eyes. "That would be more than fair," she said. And just like that, Isabella Whitmore became part of Dry Creek, at least on the surface. Within a few days, people in town began to notice things about her that did not quite match the story she told. She worked diligently, sewing torn coats, arranging shelves, and writing careful notes in the store's ledger. But the way she held a teacup during breaks, the way she stood with her back straight even after hours of work, and the way she pronounced certain words suggested a different upbringing than most immigrants passing through Montana. Some of the women whispered about it. "She talks like someone from the East," one said outside the church. "More like someone from a parlor," another replied. Others speculated that she must have been a governess or maid in a wealthy household before coming west. But Isabella never explained. Whenever someone asked about her past, she answered politely but briefly. Then she returned to her work, letting the silence close the conversation. That silence only made people more curious. And curiosity in a small frontier town often turned into suspicion. Days passed. Then one morning, the sky above the Bitterroot Mountains began to darken. The first sign was the wind. It came down from the high slopes with a bitter edge that made experienced settlers glance westward with concern. Old ranchers standing outside the saloon muttered to one another as clouds gathered above the distant peaks. "Storm coming," one of them said quietly. By midday, the wind had grown stronger, pushing dust along the streets of Dry Creek and rattling the wooden signs above the storefronts. Snow began to fall shortly after. Samuel Carter stood in his doorway watching the sky when he remembered a small parcel that needed to reach a ranch just a few miles beyond town. "Miss Whitmore," he called. Isabella looked up from the counter. "Yes. Think you could take this package out to the Miller place before the road closes?" She glanced toward the window. The wind had picked up, but the storm did not yet look dangerous. "I can try," she said. Samuel handed her the small wrapped bundle. "Best go now then." Isabella saddled the small mare Samuel kept behind the store and rode out of Dry Creek before the snowfall thickened. For a while, the road remained clear. But the Bitterroot Mountains had their own ways of changing weather without warning. Within an hour, the sky turned the color of cold iron. The wind roared down the slopes, and the falling snow became a blinding curtain that erased the road ahead. The mare grew nervous. The narrow trail along the mountainside was already disappearing beneath drifting snow. Then a sudden gust struck from the side. The horse panicked, slipping on the frozen ground. The wagon wheels skidded across the trail and lurched toward the edge. In the next second, the small cart tipped sideways. Wood cracked. The mare screamed in panic, and Isabella Whitmore vanished into the storm. High above the trail, Elias Boone was checking his trap line. His horse suddenly stopped moving. "Easy," Elias murmured. But the animal refused to take another step. Through the curtain of snow, Elias noticed something unusual below the ridge. A dark shape, half buried in white. He dismounted and pushed forward through the wind. The closer he came, the clearer the shape became. A wagon, overturned, a horse struggling in the snow, and a human form lying beside the broken wheel. Elias knelt beside the figure and brushed snow away from the woman's face. For a moment he did not recognize her. Then the wind shifted, revealing her features. "Whitmore," he muttered. Her skin was pale with cold. Her breathing was shallow. Without hesitation, Elias pulled her from the snow and wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "If I leave you here," he said quietly, "you won't see morning." He lifted her onto the saddle in front of him. The ride back to his cabin felt longer than usual. Snow erased the trail behind them, and the wind pushed against the horse like a living wall. But eventually, the dark outline of Elias's cabin appeared through the storm. Inside, he laid Isabella near the stove and fed more wood into the fire until the small room glowed with heat. He heated water, forced a few spoonfuls of broth between her lips, and waited. Hours passed. Outside, the storm howled across the mountains. Inside the cabin, Isabella drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Sometimes she spoke softly in English that sounded far more formal than anything heard in Dry Creek. Sometimes she cried out as though seeing something terrible. Late that night, Elias heard her whisper 3 trembling words. "Please, not again." He looked at her carefully. The fear in that voice had nothing to do with snow or cold. Something in her past had left a deeper wound than the storm outside. 2 days later, the blizzard finally began to fade. The Bitterroot Valley lay silent beneath a thick blanket of snow. Isabella woke slowly in the quiet cabin, confused for a moment, before memory returned. "You're in the mountains," Elias told her calmly. "Storm trapped us here." She sat up carefully. "You saved me," she said softly. Elias shrugged. "You were freezing." Later that afternoon, he prepared a small sled and guided his horse carefully down the mountain trail toward Dry Creek. The ride back was mostly silent. They spoke only a few simple words. But somewhere in that silence, something had shifted. What really changed between them? And will their paths ever cross again? Tell us what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most powerful part of the story. When Elias Boone rode away from Dry Creek after returning Isabella Whitmore to Samuel Carter's mercantile, he told himself the matter was finished. The mountains had a way of swallowing small events and letting silence close over them again. He expected life to return to its old rhythm trap lines in the morning wood, chopping in the afternoon, and the long, quiet evenings that had defined his days for years. But in Dry Creek, nothing returned to normal. For Isabella, the first morning back behind the counter felt strangely fragile. The mercantile looked exactly as it had before. The wooden shelves stacked with flour sacks and canned goods bolts of cloth rolled neatly along the wall lanterns hanging above the counter. but something had shifted in the air. Samuel Carter greeted her with the same practical nod as always. "Morning, Miss Whitmore." "Good morning, Mr. Carter." She began her work the same way she always had, carefully sorting new shipments and mending a stack of worn coats left by ranchers the week before. To anyone watching from the doorway, it might have looked like nothing had changed. But Isabella could feel the difference. Customers spoke more quietly when she walked past. Conversations paused. People watched her longer than necessary, their eyes carrying curiosity mixed with something sharper. The story had already spread through the town. A young woman from nowhere had been caught in a blizzard and rescued by the reclusive mountain man who lived high in the Bitterroot slopes. Worse still, she had spent 2 days alone with him in his cabin while the storm trapped them. Dry Creek was not a place that ignored such stories. Some people spoke about it with harmless curiosity. Others, especially the older women who gathered outside the church each afternoon, viewed the situation with visible disapproval. Isabella kept her head down and continued working. She knew how fragile her place in this town truly was. Every movement she made felt as if someone were measuring it. Every word she spoke carried the risk of being misunderstood. So she became quieter than before, answering questions briefly and avoiding conversations whenever possible. But that silence only made people more suspicious. Within a week, the whispers began. They started near the church steps where women often stood talking after Sunday service. "She doesn't look like the others," one of them murmured. "Look at how she speaks," another said. "And the way she holds herself. She's too refined for someone claiming to be a poor immigrant." Others began to notice small details. The way Isabella pronounced certain words carried the faint rhythm of education and travel. The way she bowed her head in greeting was too graceful for a frontier town. Even the stitching she used while repairing torn clothing was delicate and precise, far beyond what most hired seamstresses could manage. Speculation grew. Some guessed she had once worked as a governess for a wealthy family in the East. Others believed she might have been a servant in a noble household before running away. A few suggested darker possibilities. Samuel Carter tried to ignore the rumors, but even he began to feel uneasy as customers casually asked about his new assistant. Isabella noticed the change immediately. Where people once greeted her politely, they now watched her carefully as if waiting for proof that their suspicions were correct. The more she tried to live quietly, the more the town seemed determined to drag her past into the open. The trouble arrived on an ordinary morning. A new shipment had reached the mercantile earlier than expected, and the store was busier than usual. Ranchers crowded the counter buying supplies, while Samuel tried to manage orders and inventory at the same time. Isabella stood behind the counter sorting a small tray of items that had just arrived from Helena: buttons, sewing needles, pocket watches, and several pieces of jewelry meant for the wealthier families passing through the territory. Among them lay a silver necklace. It was delicate and finely crafted, far more expensive than most items in Dry Creek. Isabella carefully placed it on the display shelf beside the counter. By midday, the store had quieted again. A woman from town stepped forward and pointed toward the display. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to see that silver necklace." Samuel turned to retrieve it. But when he reached the shelf, it was gone. He frowned. "That's strange." He checked the counter again, then the drawer beneath it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "did you move that necklace?" "No," Isabella answered calmly. "It should still be on the shelf." Samuel searched again. The necklace had vanished. Within minutes, the entire store fell into tense confusion. Shelves were checked, drawers opened, and small boxes inspected one by one. Customers stepped aside as Samuel examined every corner of the shop. Isabella stood quietly near the counter. Inside, a cold unease was beginning to grow. Finally, Samuel sighed and rubbed his forehead. "I suppose we'll have to check everyone's belongings," he said reluctantly. The suggestion filled the room with uneasy silence. One by one, the customers allowed their pockets and bags to be searched. When it was Isabella's turn, she stepped forward without protest and placed her small personal satchel on the counter. Samuel opened it slowly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his hand froze. He lifted something from the bag, the silver necklace. The room fell completely silent. Isabella stared at it as if she had never seen the object before in her life. That is impossible," she whispered. Samuel looked at her, disappointment clouding his face. "Miss Whitmore?" He said quietly. "How did this get here? I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone must have placed it there." But the damage had already been done. People in the store stepped back from her as though the truth had revealed itself. One man muttered, "I knew something about her wasn't right." Another woman shook her head. Samuel sighed heavily. "I cannot keep you here," he said. "Not after this." Isabella tried to explain, but her words sounded weak even to her own ears. No one wanted to hear them. By the time she stepped outside the mercantile, the verdict had already spread through the street. Dry Creek had decided she was guilty. For the next 2 days, Isabella barely left the small room she had been renting behind the store. She placed the few coins she still possessed on the small wooden table and counted them again and again. They never increased. Outside, the whispers continued. One afternoon, several boys threw small stones against the steps below her window and laughed before running away. No one defended her. No one asked what had truly happened. On the third morning, Isabella packed her belongings into the worn suitcase she had carried across the ocean months earlier. She left Dry Creek before most people had even begun their day. The only place she could think of was the one place where someone had looked at her without suspicion. Boone Ridge. The journey into the mountains felt longer than before. The air grew colder as the trail climbed through the pines, and Isabella's thoughts grew heavier with every mile. By the time she reached Elias Boone's cabin, shame had settled in her chest like a stone. Elias was splitting wood when he saw her approaching. He set the axe aside but said nothing. Isabella dismounted slowly. "I lost my position," she said quietly, "and I cannot return to town." Elias waited. "I can work," she continued. "I can cook, clean, keep your books, anything. I only ask for food and a place to sleep." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Elias nodded toward a smaller cabin near the creek below the cottonwood trees. "You can stay there," he said. "Help with the ranch work and the ledgers." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Life at Boone Ridge soon found its own rhythm. Isabella cleaned the small cabin and mended blankets that had long needed repair. She cooked simple meals from the supplies Elias brought from town and began organizing the chaotic ranch ledgers he had kept for years. Elias quickly discovered she had a remarkable mind for order. Within weeks, the old records of cattle pelts, ammunition, and trade goods were arranged neatly in careful handwriting. In return, Elias taught her how to survive in the mountains. He showed her how to start a fire even when the wood was damp with frost, how to saddle a horse properly, and how to read the wind to know when a storm was coming. Their conversations were brief, but a quiet understanding slowly formed between them. One night near the end of autumn, that fragile peace was broken. The sheep near the creek began bleating in terror. Elias grabbed his rifle and rushed outside. "Wolves," he muttered. Behind him, Isabella ran from her cabin, holding a lantern. "Stay back," Elias called, but she ignored him. The lantern light swept across the fence, revealing dark shapes moving low in the night. Elias fired once into the air. The wolves scattered briefly, but the chaos continued. In the confusion, a frightened sheep crashed into Isabella, knocking her against the broken fence. A sharp edge of wood tore across her arm. She gasped, but did not drop the lantern. By the time the wolves finally retreated, blood was running down her sleeve. Elias pulled her inside the main cabin immediately. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she insisted. But when he rolled up her sleeve to clean the wound, he saw something else beneath the fresh blood. An old burn scar. The mark was deliberate, shaped like a crest. Isabella jerked her arm away instantly, but it was too late. Elias had already recognized what it meant. "That's a noble crest," he said quietly. She stared into the fire for a long time before finally speaking. "My name is Lady Isabella Whitmore," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My family once held lands and mining rights in England. A powerful man wanted them. When my father refused, he destroyed everything. Her parents had been murdered. Her brother had died defending their estate. Their wealth had been stolen through forged documents and corrupt courts." "And the mark?" Elias asked. "He burned it into my arm," she said softly, "to remind me that I belonged to him." She had escaped months later with the help of a loyal servant. From there, she had fled across Europe, then across the ocean, hoping the American frontier would hide her. "And the words you said during the storm?" Elias asked gently. Isabella looked down at her hands. "Please, not again," she whispered. "That's what I said the night my family died." Silence filled the cabin. Finally, Elias spoke. "You're safe here." For the first time since arriving in America, Isabella believed those words might actually be true. And from that night on, Boone Ridge became more than just a place to hide. It became the first place Isabella Whitmore had ever dared to call safe. Several weeks passed after the night of the wolves at Boone Ridge. Autumn deepened across the Bitterroot Valley, painting the forests with muted gold and copper. Life at the ridge had settled into a quiet rhythm again, Elias checking the traps at dawn, Isabella managing the small ledgers and tending the fire when the mountain wind turned sharp. But far below them, Dry Creek was about to change. The first sign came one cold afternoon when 3 elegant carriages rolled slowly into town from the eastern road. They were unlike anything Dry Creek had ever seen. Their wheels were polished and strong, the carriage bodies painted a glossy black that reflected the dusty Montana sun. The leather harnesses gleamed with fresh oil, and the horses pulling them were tall, powerful animals with coats brushed so clean they seemed almost unreal in a frontier settlement. People stopped in the street to stare. Children ran alongside the carriages, while ranchers leaned against hitching posts, watching with curiosity. The arrival felt like a fragment of some distant wealthy world had wandered into their rugged valley. The lead carriage stopped in front of Samuel Carter's mercantile. The door opened slowly. A tall man stepped down onto the wooden boards of the walkway. He wore a dark coat of expensive fabric tailored perfectly to his frame. His hair was neatly combed, and his gloves were made from fine leather that had never known hard work. On his face rested a smile that seemed polite and welcoming, yet carried something carefully calculated beneath it. 2 men followed him from the carriage. Unlike their employer, these men looked like they belonged on the frontier. Their coats were heavier, their eyes sharper, and their hands rested close to the pistols hanging from their belts. The elegant stranger removed his gloves slowly and surveyed the town with calm satisfaction. "Good afternoon," he said to the small crowd forming nearby. "My name is Victor Harrow." His voice carried the easy confidence of a man used to being listened to. I have come from the east to explore investment opportunities here in Montana Territory. Within minutes, curiosity had turned into fascination. Dry Creek was not a place accustomed to wealth arriving in polished carriages. Victor Harrow understood that immediately. By the evening of that same day, he had arranged a gathering outside the Mercantile and the nearby saloon where most of the town's men were already gathering after a long day's work. Harrow stood calmly on the wooden steps and spoke with an effortless charm that seemed to draw people closer. This valley, he said, gesturing toward the surrounding hills, is richer than most of you realize. He spoke about silver. He spoke about untapped veins hidden in the mountains and the possibility of transforming Dry Creek into a thriving center of trade and mining. There will be new roads, Harrow promised. New jobs. New homes. A future where your children no longer struggle through endless winters wondering whether the next harvest will fail. The words settled into the crowd like sparks falling into dry grass. Men who had spent years fighting droughts and poor soil began imagining something different. A few landowners quietly asked Harrow about prices that same afternoon. By nightfall, the rumor of silver had already spread through the entire town. Harrow watched the reaction with quiet satisfaction. He knew very well how to bend a community to his will. All he needed to do was give them a dream, bright enough to blind them. Several days later, Isabella rode down to Dry Creek for supplies. She and Elias had prepared a short list salt cloth for repairing a saddle strap and a few tools needed before winter arrived. She planned to move quickly. Ever since the Mercantile incident weeks earlier, Isabella avoided town whenever possible. She kept her visits brief and quiet, hoping to leave before anyone could recognize her. That morning seemed no different. She tied her horse outside the Mercantile and stepped onto the dusty street. Then she saw him. Victor Harrow stood beneath the wooden awning speaking with Samuel Carter and several landowners. For a single moment, Isabella could not breathe. The world seemed to narrow into a single point. The way he stood. The calm elegance of his coat. The dark ring on his right hand. The sharp intelligence hidden behind that carefully practiced smile. There was no mistake. Victor Harrow. The man who had destroyed her family. The man she had crossed an ocean to escape. Her heart began pounding violently in her chest. The sounds of Dry Creek faded into a distant blur. She stood frozen, unable to move, as the past crashed back into her life with terrifying clarity. If Harrow turned his head, if his eyes met hers without thinking, Isabella turned away. The bundle of supplies slipped from her hands as she rushed down the street toward the livery stable. People glanced at her in surprise as she stumbled past them, her face pale and her breathing uneven. Within seconds, she had reached the horse. She mounted clumsily, barely tightening the saddle straps before urging the animal into a fast gallop toward the mountain road. Behind her, Dry Creek disappeared into dust and distance. The ride back to Boone Ridge felt endless. The cold wind struck her face as she pushed the horse harder up the winding trail. But she hardly noticed the chill. Only one thought repeated endlessly in her mind. He found me. Everything she had built in Montana, the quiet life near the creek, the fragile sense of safety she had begun to feel at Elias's cabin, seemed to shatter behind her like glass. By the time Isabella reached Boone Ridge, the horse beneath her was trembling with exhaustion. Elias was repairing the sheep enclosure when he saw her approaching. Even from a distance, he knew something was wrong. The horse was moving too fast. Isabella's posture was unstable. He dropped his tools immediately and stepped forward just as the horse skidded to a stop in the yard. "Easy," Elias said, grabbing the reins before the animal could bolt again. Isabella slid down from the saddle, but her legs nearly gave way beneath her. Elias caught her arm. What happened? She could not answer. Her hands were ice cold despite the ride, and her breathing came in shallow bursts. Elias guided her inside the cabin and set a cup of water in front of her. Take your time. For several long minutes, Isabella said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the wooden table. Finally, Elias asked quietly, "Did someone threaten you?" Her lips trembled. Then the words came out in a whisper that seemed pulled from the deepest corner of her memory. "Please, not again." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard those exact words once before, in the middle of a blizzard when she had been unconscious and half frozen. But this time the words were not spoken in sleep. This time they carried the full weight of terror. Elias leaned forward slightly. "Who did you see?" Isabella closed her eyes. "Victor Harrow." The name hung heavily in the room. Slowly, Isabella began telling the story she had spent months trying not to speak aloud. "Victor Harrow wasn't just a business rival," she said quietly. "He was the man who destroyed my family. Years earlier, Harrow had attempted to force her father to sell valuable mining rights and silver investments tied to the Whitmore family estates in Europe. When her father refused, Harrow had begun dismantling their lives, piece by piece. False debts appeared. Documents were forged. Lawyers and judges who once supported the Whitmores suddenly turned against them. Then the violence came. Our home was attacked during a storm," Isabella said, her voice barely steady. "My father and brother tried to defend the estate. They didn't survive. She herself had been captured while trying to escape. Harrow believed she knew the location of several hidden assets her father had protected. He had me branded," she whispered. Elias said nothing, but his hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "And when I finally escaped," she continued, "I crossed the ocean, hoping he would never find me. But Harrow had not forgotten. And now he had arrived in Montana." "There's more," Isabella said quietly. Before her family's downfall, her father had been part of an international investment network. Among the documents he kept were references to a possible silver deposit somewhere in Montana territory. It had never been fully confirmed, but Harrow believed the Whitmore family possessed clues to its location. "He thinks I know where it is," Isabella said. "And do you?" Elias asked. She shook her head. "I only heard fragments when I was young. Letters, maps, half-finished conversations. But for Harrow, that uncertainty did not matter. To him, Isabella represented the final missing piece." Elias sat quietly for a long time. Then he spoke. "He didn't come to Dry Creek by accident." Isabella nodded slowly. "No." The pressure began almost immediately. Within a day, Harrow's men had started asking questions in town. Where exactly did Elias Boone live? How much land did he own? Had anyone seen strangers visiting his cabin? Soon messages began reaching the mountains. Harrow wished to meet Elias Boone privately. He was willing to offer a generous price for Boone Ridge. Elias ignored every message. His silence was answer enough. A few nights later, Elias discovered the first real warning. The northern fence line had been cut cleanly during the night. Not by wind, not by animals. The wire had been sliced with proper tools. Several cattle had nearly wandered off before Elias discovered the damage at dawn. He repaired the fence without speaking, but Isabella saw the change in his expression. Harrow's message was clear. He could reach Boone Ridge whenever he wanted. The following week, 2 of Elias's cattle collapsed near the western stream. At first, he believed it was illness. Then he noticed the white foam around their mouths and the strange smell in the water barrel nearby. Poison. Someone had tampered with the water supply. Elias dumped every container and burned the contaminated feed. For 2 nights, he barely slept. Isabella watched him from the cabin window and felt a growing weight of guilt pressing on her chest. Harrow was not only hunting her, he was slowly breaking the man who had protected her. When Elias traveled to Dry Creek for supplies, the town felt different. Men who once greeted him with quiet nods now avoided eye contact. Others openly complained that Boone Ridge was preventing the valley's development. Harrow had not only purchased land, he had purchased loyalty. The sheriff proved even worse. When Elias reported the cut fence and poisoned cattle, the man merely shrugged. "Without proof, there's nothing I can do," he said. Elias noticed the sheriff's brand new pocket watch glinting from his vest. The message was obvious. Law in Dry Creek now answered to Harrow's money. Elias left town with a grim understanding. Harrow did not need to win with bullets. He had already turned the town itself into his shield. Then came the worst news. Thomas Calder, known to everyone as Old Tom, was found dead near a rocky slope outside town. Officially, it was called a riding accident. But Old Tom had been one of the few people who still trusted Elias. He had warned him days earlier that Harrow's men were moving through the valley at night. When Elias arrived at the scene, he saw enough to understand the truth. Boot prints that did not belong to Tom's horse. Bruises that did not match a fall. Someone had silenced him. That night, Boone Ridge felt colder than usual. Elias sat at the wooden table with his rifle resting in front of him. Isabella sat across from him. "If I leave," she said quietly, "perhaps Harrow will stop." But even as she said the words, she knew they were not true. Harrow wanted more than her. He wanted the land. He wanted the valley. And he wanted complete control. Running had never truly stopped him before. After a long silence, Elias spoke. "If we keep running, he wins." Isabella lowered her eyes. "I've run my entire life." Elias looked toward the window where the dark mountains stood against the night sky. "Then maybe it's time we stop." She looked up slowly. "You mean fight him?" Elias nodded. Harrow had brought war to Boone Ridge. He had destroyed peace-killed friends and threatened everything Elias had left in the world. Now there was only one path remaining. The fire in the hearth crackled quietly as they sat across from each other. They were no longer just rescuer and refugee. They were 2 survivors standing on the same side of a coming storm. And for the first time since Harrow's arrival, they were not preparing to run. They were preparing to end it. By morning, Elias had already begun forming the only plan that could force Harrow into a place where his money, his influence, and his hired guns would mean less than the mountains themselves. "What does he want more than anything?" Elias asked. Isabella did not hesitate. "The silver," she said quietly. Harrow's obsession had always been the same. Wealth, control, ownership of anything valuable enough to reshape his power. If he believed a silver vein existed somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, especially one tied to the Whitmore family, he would chase it without hesitation. That was the weakness Elias intended to use. "I'm going to give him the story he wants to hear," Elias said. The rumor began carefully. Elias did not announce anything openly. Instead, he allowed fragments of information to escape in places where they would spread naturally. A ranch hand passing through Boone Ridge heard Elias mention unusual stone in the western hills. A blacksmith in Dry Creek overheard a traveler say that the mountain man had been seen riding toward Raven's Pass several days in a row. A wagon driver claimed Elias had shown him a strange piece of rock that glittered faintly in the sun. Each detail alone meant little, but together they formed something far more powerful. A story. Within 2 days, Dry Creek was buzzing with speculation. Boone found silver, someone said at the saloon. In Raven's Pass, another added, must be a big vein if he's keeping quiet about it. Elias added just enough evidence to keep the rumor alive. He left a piece of pale stone near the forge where Harrow's men might notice it. He allowed a merchant to hear him mutter about the western ridge while loading supplies. Isabella helped refine the story carefully. It has to sound real, she said one evening, studying a rough map of the surrounding mountains. But it also has to feel urgent. So Harrow believes he must act before you bring someone else in. Elias nodded slowly. They were not baiting Harrow with threats. They were baiting him with greed. The reaction came faster than either of them expected. Within 48 hours, the rumor had reached Victor Harrow. His men immediately began asking questions in town. Where had Elias been riding? Had anyone seen rock samples? Was Raven's Pass accessible this time of year? Elias made sure the answers remained incomplete but convincing. Harrow's patience quickly dissolved. If a silver vein truly existed, he intended to claim it before Elias could reveal it publicly. And so, before dawn on a bitterly cold morning, Victor Harrow left Dry Creek with 6 armed men. They rode quietly through the empty streets while most of the town still slept. No witnesses, no official claim, no negotiations. Harrow intended to take whatever he found. The men riding beside him were the same hardened gunmen Elias had seen around Harrow for weeks. Each carried a rifle across his saddle and a revolver at his belt. They rode strong horses bred for long mountain travel. Harrow himself rode at the front, his posture confident. In his mind, the outcome was already decided. Elias Boone was only one man. Isabella Whitmore was only a fugitive. By the time the sun rose, Harrow expected to own the richest discovery in Montana territory. What he did not know was that Elias and Isabella had predicted his exact route before he ever left Dry Creek. Raven's Pass waded deep within the broken slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains. The place had earned its name long before Elias had ever set foot there. The narrow canyon cut through jagged cliffs like a wound in the earth, its walls rising steeply on either side. The wind moved strangely through the passage, twisting echoes and making sounds difficult to locate. To a stranger, it felt disorienting. To someone who knew the terrain, it was something else entirely. A trap. Elias had explored the pass years earlier while trapping in the mountains. He had studied the loose rock formations and the narrow choke points where the canyon walls pressed closest together. He had once described it to another trapper as a stone jaw. Once someone rode too far into its center, escape became uncertain. During the 2 nights before Harrow's arrival, Elias had worked quietly in the canyon. He identified several large boulders already loosened by seasonal freezing and thawing. With careful effort, he tied them in place using hidden lines of rope anchored behind the rocks above. Some ropes stabilized the stones temporarily. Others were connected to a single cut point farther along the ridge. All Elias had to do was sever that line. Gravity would do the rest. Isabella helped with the final preparations. She carried ammunition, memorized the observation points along the ridge, and learned the signals Elias would use during the fight. They had very little manpower. That meant every bullet had to count. Every movement had to matter. Before dawn, Elias took his position along the slope, overlooking the narrowest part of the canyon. Isabella climbed to a rocky outcrop farther east that gave her a wide view of the pass. Below them, Raven's Pass waited. The sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon shortly after sunrise. Harrow and his men rode directly into the pass, following the false trail Elias had deliberately left behind. Hoof prints, disturbed earth, signs that someone had been digging along the rock wall. "Looks like Boone was here," one of the gunmen muttered. Harrow nodded impatiently. Then we're close. The riders moved deeper into the canyon. The narrow passage forced them to stretch their formation slightly. The men at the front advanced cautiously, while those behind lagged several yards apart. One gunman glanced upward at the towering cliffs. "Don't like this place," he said quietly. Harrow ignored him. "If Boone found silver here," he said, "we take it now." By the time the final rider entered the narrow choke point, Elias's hand tightened around the rope above him. He waited until every horse and every man had passed the trigger point. Then he cut the line. The sound that followed began with a single sharp crack. Then the entire slope roared to life. Boulders tore free from the cliff and thundered down into the canyon. Smaller stones cascaded after them like a collapsing wall. Within seconds, the entrance behind Harrow's group vanished beneath tons of rock. Horses screamed. Men shouted in confusion. One of the gunmen was thrown violently from his saddle as a rock slammed into the ground beside him. Dust filled the canyon. Harrow spun in his saddle, his eyes widening in disbelief. They were trapped. Before anyone could react properly, the first rifle shot echoed from the shadows ahead. Another gunman dropped instantly from his horse. The canyon erupted in chaos. Harrow's men fired blindly into the smoke and dust, their shots ricocheting wildly against the stone walls. The echoing blasts made it nearly impossible to identify the direction of the attack. Elias never remained in one place. He fired once, then vanished into another narrow passage between the rocks. Seconds later, another shot came from a completely different angle. To Harrow's men, it sounded as if they were surrounded. "Hold formation," Harrow shouted. But his voice shattered into fragments as the canyon twisted the sound. The men could not even hear each other clearly. Raven's Pass offered no straight battlefield, only confusion, only shadows. Elias moved through the terrain like a ghost who knew every stone by memory. He pulled one isolated gunman into a narrow bend and dropped him at close range before the man could react. Another tried climbing toward higher ground, only to lose his footing when Elias shot the rock directly beneath him. Each shot was deliberate, each movement controlled. From the ridge above, Isabella watched the battle unfold through the iron sights of her rifle. Her hands trembled at first, but when she saw two gunmen circling along the slope toward Elias's position, something inside her hardened. She steadied her breathing. The first man appeared briefly between two rocks. Isabella fired. The bullet struck his shoulder and knocked him backward down the slope. The second man spun around, trying to locate the source of the shot. Isabella fired again. This time he fell without a sound. Below, Elias glanced upward for a brief moment. He understood immediately. They were fighting together now. The loss of two more men shattered what little confidence remained among Harrow's forces. The survivors scattered, searching desperately for cover. Harrow finally looked up and saw Isabella standing on the ridge. Recognition flashed in his eyes. After all these years, the last Whitmore stood directly above him. But desperation made him reckless. While Elias repositioned to reload his rifle, Harrow slipped into a narrow path, winding upward along the cliff. Isabella never saw him coming. She had just bent down to retrieve more ammunition when loose stones rattled behind her. She turned too late. Harrow seized her arm and ripped the rifle from her hands. His revolver pressed coldly against the side of her head. "Drop the gun, Boone," he shouted down the canyon. Elias froze. For several seconds, the entire battlefield fell silent. Harrow laughed hoarsely. "You should have run when you had the chance." Then, savoring the moment, he revealed one final truth. "Your family's death wasn't random either, Boone." Elias said nothing. Harrow smiled. Years ago, we cleared several small landowners from strategic valleys. Some refused to sell. The meaning struck Elias instantly. The fire, the sickness, the supply shortages that had destroyed his family. Harrow's network had been behind it all. Rage surged through Elias, but he forced himself to remain calm. He stepped slowly forward. Let her go? Harrow tightened his grip. Not a chance. Then Elias moved. In a single explosive motion, he struck Harrow's gun hand aside and shoved Isabella out of the line of fire, just as the revolver discharged harmlessly into the air. Both men crashed to the ground. They rolled across the rocky slope, fists and elbows striking wildly as the fight turned savage. Harrow fought like a desperate animal. Elias fought like a man who had lost too much already. At last, Harrow scrambled backward toward a fallen revolver near the edge of the slope. But when he stepped back, the ground beneath him crumbled. The loose stone Elias had weakened days earlier shifted suddenly. Harrow's balance vanished. He reached for the rock face and found only empty air. He slipped backward beneath a massive boulder perched precariously above the slope. The rock cracked loose. A thunderous roar filled the canyon. Isabella saw Elias leap clear just as the massive stone crashed downward. Victor Harrow's scream lasted only a moment before the falling rock buried him beneath the weight of the mountain itself. Silence followed. Slowly, the dust drifted away. Elias stood breathing heavily as he stared at the rubble. Isabella stepped toward him. Neither of them needed to ask whether Harrow had survived. Raven's Pass had already delivered its verdict. Weeks later, winter returned quietly to the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow settled across the valley, covering the scars of the battle beneath a blanket of white. News of Harrow's death spread through Dry Creek quickly. Without his influence, the fragile web of bribery and intimidation around the town collapsed. The sheriff grew cautious. The landowners who had once praised Harrow now pretended they had never trusted him. High above the valley, Boone Ridge remained unchanged. But its silence had become something new. Not isolation. Peace. One morning, Elias and Isabella stood together on the hill behind the cabin, where the 3 old graves overlooked the valley. The wind moved softly through the frozen grass. For years, Elias had looked at those graves as the end of everything he once loved. Now standing beside Isabella, the place felt different. Not empty. Remembered. In the weeks that followed, Isabella stopped calling herself Lady Whitmore. She did not deny her past, but she no longer lived inside it. Montana had given her something Europe never could. A place where she could exist without fear. Spring preparations began early. Elias repaired damaged fences and rebuilt sections of the barn. Isabella organized supplies and trade accounts, ensuring Boone Ridge could grow rather than merely survive. Together, they turned the isolated mountain homestead into something stronger. A ranch. A future. Spring returned to the Bitterroot Valley slowly, as it always did, with quiet patience rather than sudden change. Months had passed since the battle at Raven's Pass. The snow that once covered the mountains began to retreat, melting into thin, silver streams that ran down the slopes and across the fields below. Patches of green pushed through the earth where the winter had once ruled everything. At Boone Ridge, the ranch began to feel alive again. The past winter had been a time of rebuilding. Elias Boone had spent long days repairing broken fence lines, reinforcing the barn roof, and clearing fallen branches left by heavy snowstorms. Isabella worked beside him whenever the tasks allowed it, organizing supplies, keeping records, and managing the trade that slowly returned to the ranch. By early spring, the place looked different. The cattle moved calmly across the growing pasture. The barn stood solid again. Smoke rose from the chimney of the cabin each morning. Boone Ridge was no longer simply surviving. It was beginning to thrive. Down in Dry Creek, the town had also changed. Victor Harrow's promises of wealth and silver had vanished with him beneath the stones of Raven's Pass. Without his influence, the restless hunger that had once gripped the town faded away. People returned to the routines they understood. Farmers repaired their wagons. Shopkeepers reopened quiet lines of trade. Conversations in the saloon no longer revolved around mines or land deals, but about cattle prices, weather, and the coming harvest. Life had steadied itself again, yet, as the town returned to normal, a small news story began circulating quietly through the streets. It was about a child. At first, people noticed him only in passing. A thin boy sleeping beside the stable wall, a small figure curled beneath a blanket near the mercantile porch. Sometimes he could be seen early in the morning helping sweep dust from the blacksmith's doorway or carrying buckets of water for travelers' horses. The boy never asked for money. He simply worked when work appeared. After a few weeks, people began calling him something simple: the boy from the stable. Samuel Carter noticed him first. One evening, the old shopkeeper found the boy sitting near the back of the mercantile eating crumbs of stale bread someone had left behind. Samuel stepped outside and handed him a bowl of warm soup. The boy accepted it quietly. "Got a name?" "Son," Samuel asked. "Daniel," the boy replied. He spoke softly, as if unused to being questioned. Samuel allowed him to sit near the stove while he finished the soup. But the mercantile was small, and Samuel had little space to offer. Each night, Daniel returned to the same place beside the stable. Some townspeople discussed helping him. A few suggested sending the boy to a larger town where an orphanage might take him. But most families in Dry Creek were struggling themselves. They already had mouths to feed. And so Daniel remained, a small figure drifting quietly through the edges of the town. Weeks later, Samuel Carter finally asked him the question no one else had asked. "What happened to your family?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "My father had a ranch south of the valley." Samuel nodded slowly. He knew the region Daniel described. Several small ranches had once stood there before disputes over land began spreading across the territory. "What about your mother?" Samuel asked gently. Daniel looked down at the floor. "My father died first." There had been a fight, Daniel explained. Men had come to pressure local ranchers into selling their land. The argument had turned violent. His father never returned from it. After that, the ranch had fallen apart quickly. Supplies disappeared. Neighbors left. Illness spread through the region during the harsh winter that followed. Daniel's mother grew sick. Without medicine or help nearby, she did not survive long. The boy had walked for days after burying her. He had come to Dry Creek because it was the only town his father had ever spoken about. But when he arrived, no one knew him. Samuel Carter listened in silence. By the time Daniel finished speaking, Samuel understood something the boy himself might not yet realize. Daniel was one of the final victims of the same system Victor Harrow had built. Another quiet casualty of greed. One morning not long afterward, Isabella rode down from Boone Ridge to purchase supplies. The sun had only begun rising over Dry Creek when she tied her horse outside the mercantile. As she stepped down, she noticed a boy beside the blacksmith shop, gathering scattered pieces of coal from the ground. He worked carefully, placing each piece into a bucket. His movements were slow but determined. Isabella watched for a moment. There was something about the way he worked that caught her attention. Not desperation, not laziness, just quiet effort. When the boy finished carrying the bucket inside, Isabella approached him and held out a coin. "Thank you for helping," she said. The boy looked at the coin, but did not take it. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Do you need help carrying your supplies?" The answer surprised her. She studied his face more carefully. His eyes carried a kind of caution. She recognized instantly the guarded look of someone who had learned early that the world could disappear without warning. Samuel Carter stepped outside just then. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said. Isabella nodded. Then she gestured toward the boy. "Who is he?" Samuel sighed. "That's Daniel. Been around here a few weeks now." Inside the mercantile, Samuel told her the boy's story. Isabella listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, she stood quietly for a long time. Through the window, she could see Daniel sitting beside the stable again, watching the horses. For a moment, she saw not the boy, but something of her own past. A person left behind by forces larger than themselves. A person running from a world that had collapsed. That afternoon, Isabella rode back to Boone Ridge. Elias was working near the pasture fence when she arrived. He saw immediately that something was on her mind. "What happened in town?" he asked. She dismounted and led the horse toward the barn. "There's a boy in Dry Creek," she said. Elias listened quietly as she described Daniel and the story Samuel Carter had told her. When she finished, Elias remained silent for several moments. Finally, he asked one question. "How old did Carter say the boy was?" 8. Isabella answered, "Maybe 9. Elias looked out toward the grazing cattle. For a moment, his thoughts drifted backward through his own childhood. Through the years before tragedy had taken everything from him. A child alone in these mountains rarely lasted long. Still, he said nothing more. That evening, they sat near the fire inside the cabin. The room glowed softly from the light of burning pine logs. Isabella finally spoke the thought she had been carrying all day. "We could bring him here." Elias looked up slowly. "Boone Ridge has space," she continued, "and he has nowhere else." Elias leaned back in his chair. "Raising a child out here isn't simple," he said. "Life on the ranch demanded hard work, long winters, endless responsibilities. A child would have to learn everything quickly." Isabella nodded. "I know." Then she added quietly, "Neither was surviving the last year." The words lingered in the warm air of the cabin. Elias said nothing, but the silence between them held an answer. A few days later, Elias rode down to Dry Creek alone. He found Daniel exactly where Samuel had said he would be, inside the stable cleaning straw from one of the stalls. The boy worked carefully, dragging a pitchfork through the hay and stacking it neatly along the wall. Elias watched for several minutes before speaking. "You done with that stall yet?" Daniel turned. "Almost." When he finished, Elias handed him a piece of bread. Daniel hesitated before taking it. "I can work for it," he said. Elias nodded slightly. "You know how to ride? My father taught me." They studied one another for a moment. Elias saw the same stubborn resilience in the boy that the mountains had carved into his own life. Before leaving, Elias spoke again. "There's a ranch up in Boone Ridge." Daniel waited. "It needs hands willing to work." The boy asked quietly, "What kind of work?" Elias shrugged. "The kind that keeps a place alive." Daniel thought about that for a long moment. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Would I have to leave when winter comes?" Elias met his eyes. "No." Several days later, Daniel rode up the mountain beside Elias. The journey to Boone Ridge took most of the morning. When they reached the ranch, Isabella was waiting near the cabin porch. Daniel climbed down from the horse slowly. His eyes moved across the wide fields, the barn, and the distant Bitterroot peaks. Everything looked enormous compared to the small corners of Dry Creek where he had been sleeping. Isabella stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Welcome to Boone Ridge." Daniel did not answer immediately, but something in his expression changed. For the first time in months, he looked like someone who had arrived somewhere he might stay. The weeks that followed were filled with learning. Elias taught Daniel how to repair fences, brush horses, and recognize signs of trouble in the pasture. Isabella taught him reading and writing in the evenings by the light of the cabin lamp. At first, Daniel remained cautious, but slowly he began to relax. One evening, as the cattle returned from grazing and the sky turned gold behind the mountains, the three of them stood near the barn, watching the herd move through the gate. Daniel looked around at the land stretching toward the valley. "Does this place have a name?" he asked. Elias followed his gaze across the fields. Then he answered simply, "It does now." By the time summer approached, Boone Ridge had become something new. Elias was no longer the solitary mountain man people whispered about in Dry Creek. Isabella was no longer a noblewoman hiding from her past. And Daniel was no longer the boy sleeping beside the stable. Three lives that had once been broken in different ways now stood together on the same piece of land. And for the first time in many years, Boone Ridge was no longer just a place to endure the world. It was a place to build one. Thank you so much for spending this time with our story. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from.